Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. Here we are, 1 week away from the 2022 U.S. midterms. I'm very excited to see how things shake out. And I can promise for this episode, no tricks, only treats with my guest, Zach McCrary. He is a partner, pollster, and strategist at Impact Research, formerly known as ALG Polling, which is a public opinion research firm that aids Democratic candidates and causes up and down the ballot. They worked previously with candidates like Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and candidates all over the U.S. at different levels of government. So Impact Research is really a top-level firm offering a full suite of services to political campaigns, such as brand management, message development, strategy and targeting, and general strategic consulting, which is what we're going to talk about with Zach. And what we're going to talk about in this episode is not particularly a focus on social media, because that's not Zach's particular wheelhouse. But as he'll say, he sits at the table with people who are working in digital consulting. And it's interesting to actually hear from his perspective kind of what is the impact of digital and how has he noticed that in his polling work? What is his polling work? Actually, what is the modern day pollster? We'll talk about that. And in particular, what I thought was really interesting, and we'll pick up on towards the middle of the interview, is how the importance of television really hasn't been overtaken by social media. That's something that's important to keep in mind. And we'll talk about why that is for political campaigns. We'll also look how changes in hardware, particularly the emergence of the cell phone and later the smartphone, has affected polling practices. We'll also talk about focus groups, which Zach is also well versed in, has conducted a number of them. What is a political focus group? How are those insights different from what you would get from more of a quantitative polling measure? And what I really found interesting about this episode was our discussion of media markets, which if you don't know what those are and their importance for political advertising, you can dial back to episode 95 with Professor Travis Ridout, where we talked about his work comparing political television ads with Facebook ads and why those media markets are so important. And so I think it's interesting that Zach brings them up as well and provides some nice examples for how they are still important, both for campaign advertising, but also in terms of where wealthy contributors may decide to give money to political campaigns. And I think that's just such a nice example of the relationship between structure and agency in a political context, something we talked about last episode in terms of campaign structures, right? Structures matter, whether they are the structure of a campaign or maybe the structure of the media market in relation to the congressional district. That's an example that I use to teach structure and agency to undergrads all the way up to PhDs. And I'll just quickly segue into welcoming any students from my media and political engagement class, which kicks off this week. Pay special attention to that relationship between the media markets and political messaging, because it's something we're going to go over quite a bit in class. The last bit of housekeeping I'll do is to promote Zach's podcast, which is called Pro Politics with Zach McCrary, where he interviews political operatives about their backstories, how they got into working for political campaigns, as well as their war stories from the front, which I think is absolutely fantastic, especially some of the older episodes going back to campaigns in the 70s and 80s. One episode I can particularly recommend if you want to start off is with Lance Tarrance, and there you'll learn why Hillary Rodham Clinton is Hillary Rodham Clinton and not just Hillary Rodham. I thought that was quite an interesting tidbit of American history political information. But there'll be a link down to that podcast in the episode description. Definitely check it out. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Zach McCrary. Again, he is a partner at Impact Research. Zach, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Yeah, Michael, it's great to connect with you. Thank you.
So to start out here, I know that your work on campaigns is often condensed to the job title of pollster, but you view your role as more of a strategic partner to campaigns. So could you break down that distinction for us? How do pollsters both deliver data, but also partner with campaigns at a more strategic level?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And if all one does, even if somebody is a pretty savvy political observer, if what you see on television or movies or on the West Wing it's pollsters who come in and say who's up, who's down, and then they leave the room, or here's what people think about this issue. Plus 10 this way, plus 10 that way. That's usually the visual that you get from pollsters in a lot of ways, and in the way that it's consumed in the media. But as it relates to campaigns, whether it's political campaigns, issue campaigns, and it's not mostly what I do, but I also work with corporations and nonprofits as well. And pollsters are really a strategic partner to the overall effort. Polling, the idea of who's up a little, who's down a little, that's important. But really, what most polling is doing is trying to help change voter opinion, move people in one direction or another. And the nuts and bolts of that often are much more about message development. In terms of a survey, we might have a 15, 18, 20-minute survey, and maybe 30 seconds is asking, are you going to vote for Biden or Trump? The rest of the survey, the rest of the real estate is attempting to determine, well, what issues are most important to you? What do you like about Biden? What do you like about Trump? Of the vast messages available to talk about, from the Democratic perspective, what's good about Biden or what's bad about Trump. Biden is an example, been in office for decades and decades, had hundreds, thousands of votes, policy positions on everything under the sun, had a compelling personal story, had a foreign policy expertise, was vice president. So you could, even if you had a 3-hour survey or 3-hour movie to express all the things that Biden has done, you wouldn't have enough time. And in reality, most campaigns are distilled into 30-second TV ads, increasingly 15-second or 6-second digital ads, mail pieces. That the idea with mail pieces is that you're only consuming the information on a mail piece. Nobody expects a voter to read every word on a mail piece, but you have, from the time they get the mail piece out of their mailbox till they go to the trash can. So you have a glance or two or three at a mail piece. And so what polling is doing is trying to distill what is most important about a race, about a candidate, about an issue into very simple components, understanding that the average voter is not dumb, is not oblivious to these issues, but has so much going on in their lives that they're not going to go to a campaign website and absorb everything. They're not going to watch a 30-minute infomercial on these things. You have just very small ability to distill what is most important about a campaign. And that's really what most of what a pollster is trying to do in a political campaign. If there's one or two or three things that a voter knows about our candidate, knows about the other candidate, what do we want those one or two things to be? Because there's very limited bandwidth to get messages across. So a pollster is one part of that. We like to see ourselves as the message watchdog. Pollsters are one seat at the table. We don't come down from the mountain with stone tablets and say, here's what the TV ad has to be. Here's the only words that can come out of the candidate's mouth. But you have this wealth of data, this data-driven information to help make some of these decisions. And a pollster has one seat at the table, often with a media consultant. And conventionally that was TV, but more and more that's TV plus digital plus direct mail, plus some of the field consultants who were working to turn voters out, plus campaign managers. Oftentimes candidates themselves are very involved in this. So a pollster has one seat at the table, an important seat, but only one out of 3, 4, 5 seats at the table. And ultimately, we see ourselves as strategic partners to make sure that we're using the data we get to help everybody else on a campaign, to make sure that the campaign and the candidates resources, meaning their money that they work hard to raise, their time that they work hard to raise, is informed by data. And ultimately, whether it is a TV ad or a mail piece or website content or a script when somebody's knocking on a door or calling people, whether it's a 10-minute stump speech, all of that in some way is usually informed by polling. And so that's how we see ourselves as a strategic partner. It's not just you're in the field and you poll and you say who's up, who's down, dump a poll on the desk and say, well, call me again in a couple months when you're ready to poll again. But pollsters in the campaign sense are very much integrated in the day-to-day, sometimes hour by hour ebb and flow of campaigns that's often informed by polling, but also to sometimes you don't have the luxury of everything in a campaign being informed by polling. So pollsters are part of the group that are operating in real time and fully integrated as a strategic member of a campaign team.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a whole battery of questions for you, where
Sure.
and sort of me polling you for information. But one of the things I'm curious about is, where does that kind of knowledge or expertise come from? Because if you look at, for example, a academic type of survey, there'll be handbooks on best practices on what to ask, how to get the variables you need. Whereas I get the sense from you, it's much more about building experience, maybe
Hmm.
drawing from the context to really understand. So where do you get these type of insights from? Is it just accumulated experience, or is it something about having a kind of spidey sense for what might resonate with voters in certain context? Or kind of how do you sort of form that knowledge base or strategy to impart that on campaigns?
Yeah, the best pollsters are a good mix and have both of the sides of the coin of the science of polling, which is intense, which is about writing a questionnaire, making sure the questionnaire itself is not introducing unnecessary bias or bias that's compromising the ultimate goals. So there's a whole, you could have a whole college course load about survey writing and informing how you're writing questions and getting the right data. And increasingly, it's become even more complex. The methodology and the sampling. How do you devise a sample where you are trying to get a representative sample of the electorate, if that's what we're talking about here, if we're talking about a political campaign. How do you figure out, who are the voters you want to talk to in the abstract? That's one piece. And then how do you weaponize that? How do you mechanically try to get those voters or the most representative sample that you can? And that's the verbiage of the questionnaire. I think is not changed that much, but in my 18 years in polling has dramatically become more complicated to get the right sample, to devise the appropriate sample, and then to ensure that your ultimate final product looks like that representative sample. And there's sort of whole conversations about response bias and response rates, which are getting lower and lower each year. All sorts of challenges that I don't know that people, I don't know that we realized at the time or the industry realized it at the time, but just how straightforward it was, until the cell phone era, late 2000s, the 2010s, when more people started having cell phones rather than landlines. And once that happened, then there was the explosion of smartphones, and everything has gotten very complicated since then. And the line that I've used for a while is that it's never been easier and cheaper to poll the wrong way, and it's never been more complicated, more difficult, and more expensive to poll the right way. And so there is that science part of it, where having a grounding in statistics and methodology and sampling and all of that is an important piece of the polling. But at least certainly in the political world, there's also a real import of the art of politics, the art of polling. It's not just what do the numbers say, but how do you extract meaning from them? What is the story that the numbers are telling you? How do you weaponize that for a campaign? How do the numbers on a page fit into TV ads and mail plans and get out the vote plans and stump speeches and the ebbs and flow of campaigns? How do you deal with those day in and day out? You don't have the luxury of just being able to be in the sterile laboratory of an academic setting or operate under hypotheticals. There are lots of surprises and crises, big and small, in campaigns, and having the art of campaigns, the art of polling is important. So, sort of the street smarts and the book smarts. I think the most effective pollsters are the ones who marry both of those two. The most effective polling firms are those who have plenty of people who are the MIT math whizzes, and you need that as part of your polling firm, especially these days as everything has gotten more complex and complicated and elaborate. But you also need people who come out of the campaign world, who have been in the shoes of campaign managers, who have had to make decisions while under fire and under duress and in the midst of crisis. So it really is very much both an art and science, the book smarts and the street smarts. If you could have a Frankenstein's monster for a pollster, you would want really both of those elements present to be the most effective in the real world operating for campaigns.
Very appropriate reference with Halloween coming up. But you mentioned it a bit, sort of the transformation of the smartphone and kind of what that did for polling. And so I know that your work isn't necessarily explicitly about digital communication or social media, but you've been working on campaigns for the better part of 2 decades. So from your perspective as a pollster, I mean, have you seen, or in what ways has social media kind of changed campaign structures, messaging, data, or has it really been kind of overblown as to how transformative these technologies have been in terms of message strategy and voter contact? Is it basically just an extension of old practices, or is it something entirely new altogether?
I think it's more on the new side, frankly. When I first got started, my first cycle working really in depth in politics was the '06 cycle, 8 and 10, really working, getting my bearings as both a pollster and a strategist. And still at that point, if you were a campaign and you had reasonable resources, if you wanted voters to know something, if you wanted the electorate to know something, you could buy a TV ad, put it on broadcast TV, maybe layer in a little bit of cable television, and 85, 90% plus of the electorate would absorb that information if you put enough resources behind it. I don't know what that number is now, what the scale, what the scope, what the coverage would be for a similar spot. But there really is nothing today, in my experience, that you can replicate. Even adding all these things together, I don't think it's possible to communicate in a meaningful way with 90% plus of the electorate. Now, presidential races, which we may talk about, are a little different animal because they take on sort of an ecosystem of their own. But if you're running for Congress or Senate or governor or state legislature or mayor, there's just no ability to communicate with 85, 90% of the electorate in a broad swath like you could do in the not too distant past. So I think that's the biggest change, is that, it used to be if I was running for Congress and put up a TV ad in my district, 9 out of 10 voters I could communicate with and would have some degree of confidence. Maybe they like my message, maybe they like me, maybe they don't, but I'm at least getting the message that I want to them. I don't know if that number was 90% 15 years ago. I don't know what it is now, if it's 60% or 50% or 65%, but it's a dramatic drop from what it was just a generation or half generation ago politically. And some people will tell you, and it's accurate to some degree, that television is still important, which that is the case. And broadcast television, is still the main course of most political media campaigns. But then all you have to do is just layer in digital and online buys and go find people. And then if you piece all this together, you can still get to that point where you've pretty much fully saturated the electorate. I don't have any great numbers to throw out or any rigorous studies, but just from seeing data day in and day out, I do think there is a much lower share, much more compressed ability to be able to communicate with voters than there was before everyone was online, before everyone had a phone in their pocket. So I don't know if that's 50, 60% versus 80, 90%, something like that is where my gut is, and it depends on what part of the country you're talking about as well, and what demographics are. So that's a big difference, to be where all you really want to do as a campaign, at the end of the day, if you're able to get your message out to the voters, that's sort of all you can ask for at the end of the day. Your opponent's going to do their thing, and they're going to have their message as well. But you think, I've got a good candidate, we've got the right message, we have a poll affirmed message, a data-driven message, and that's all you can ask for. In the old days, you could sort of accept that, and that's how campaigns were won or lost. Now it's much more difficult. Even if you got a good campaign, even if you got a good message, it's much more difficult to get that message out there and to have it saturate and penetrate the electorate. So that's just a whole host of challenges. And I don't think that that digital ads, an ad that pops up on Facebook or a 15-second ad before you watch your YouTube video, I don't think that has taken the place or has been a good substitute in terms of the depth and the ability to get a message through to voters. And so we're just have less ability to communicate with voters than we did before. And it's one of the reasons I think why basic partisanship is ruling the day more than it used to. It's not the only reason, but if you're not really hearing a ton from either candidate, if that message isn't getting through, then you're just defaulting to, okay, well, I usually vote Democrat, I usually vote Republican, versus, again, 15, 20 years ago, maybe you usually voted Republican, but if you heard a message that you liked and that came through from a Democratic candidate, you might at least give that candidate some consideration. If you're not hearing anything from that candidate, you have really nothing else to do but just default to your partisan cues. So in terms of how campaigns are run, how campaigns are won or lost, I think that's the biggest change is the day by day erosion of the effectiveness of broadcast TV. And even though people aren't watching less content than they used to, maybe they're watching more content than ever, that the YouTube pre-roll ad is not at all as effective in getting messages across as 15, 20 years ago the 30-second political TV ad was, when everybody was watching Seinfeld on a Thursday night. That's just a dramatically different change, which makes it harder to communicate and harder for these races to live and die by anything other than the fundamental partisanship of their electorate.
Yeah, that's a really useful observation about the sort of mass exposure through television. I think we tend to think about this in terms of something that was like a phenomenon of the 70s or 80s. But I think what you're saying is that that same general idea still held up until the early 2000s, which is useful, I think, to keep in mind. But let's chat about these midterms, the upcoming midterms. What have you noticed? It could be social media, digital communication, or otherwise that is maybe different from previous election cycles. What are the key challenges this time around? I feel like we have to keep kind of taking the pulse of campaigns every 2 years to see what's happening. What have you noticed out there in the field that might be different this time?
Yeah, each midterm, feels different in the moment, but then more often than not, it does seem like it defaults back to fundamentals. And this midterm has had more twists and turns. And for the first period or two of this midterm, it felt very dire for Democrats. And that's, again, goes back to fundamentals. Midterms are usually about fundamentals. And we're at a point where Biden's approvals, and listen, I'm a Biden fan, our firm works for Biden, but Biden's approvals throughout most of the last year plus have been negative. They've actually bounced back to some degree over the last 2, 3 months, but are still in the red. And so if you have an unpopular Democratic president, you have Democrats in control of both the House and the Senate. Congress has, largely negative ratings. The right track, wrong track number is deeply in the red. There's a lot of economic pessimism out there that remains. So most of these fundamentals are pointing against the party in power. And that's, Democrats, you're staring down the business end of these negative fundamentals if you're the Democrats. And throughout most of the first phase or two of the midterm cycle, it felt like that was what was happening, that Democrats were headed toward, a bloodbath in a lot of ways. The Democrats were, almost a sure thing to lose the House. The Democratic margin in the Senate, very narrow to begin with, was very questionable. And then you had the abortion decision, the Dobbs Supreme Court decision that came in, and that reshuffled the deck, at least temporarily. And what causes wave year elections, what causes political waves, and it's more likely to be in a midterm, is two things are happening at the same time. One is that independent voters are dramatically in one direction or the other. You would see a 15 or 20 point margin among independent voters toward one party or another versus independents, breaking sort of 50-50, which might be the natural status quo. But independent voters break strongly for one party against another party. That's one component. And the other is that one party is just more enthusiastic and turns out at a higher rate than the other party. And you put those two together, the independents and the turnout, and that's where political waves happen. But what happened after the Dobbs decision is Democratic enthusiasm, which had been sluggish, which was not, you saw that in the Virginia governor's race, where Republican enthusiasm outpaced Democratic enthusiasm, and a state that Biden won easily in the presidential flipped a Republican in the governor's race. But in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, there was this, I think, legitimate, and there still is to some degree, this legitimate spike in Democratic enthusiasm, and some of the voters, Democratic oriented voters who were, the least enthusiastic about Biden at that moment in time, younger voters, specifically sort of softer Democratic voters, all of a sudden were engaged in the system, in the process, in a way that they had not been in the midterm up to that point. And so those were the two components that independents still, throughout most of this cycle, have had a Republican lean to them. But in the wake of Dobbs, there's some indication that Democrats were either as enthusiastic as Republicans, or maybe even more so in some of these special elections. And so I think that is sort of the tug of war we're seeing. Does the Democratic enthusiasm wane, or does the Republican enthusiasm ratchet up the closer we get to the election? And can Democrats do anything to mitigate some difficult numbers, the difficult fundamentals of the electorate, which are really present, especially with independent voters? So I think those are the cross currents here that make this election a little bit more difficult to anticipate exactly what's happened in a 2010 and a 2014, which turned out to be Republican waves. You could sort of see that coming. You saw that independents were breaking for Republicans, and Republicans were more enthusiastic in a 2018, going back to even further to 2006, 2008, which were Democratic wave years. You saw independents breaking toward Democrats and Democratic enthusiasm outpacing Republicans. That led to Democratic wave years. This, I think, there's more question marks about what this year has in store politically. But at the end of the day, it's hard to you're not going to go broke often betting on the fundamentals to carry the day in midterms, and those, are generally aligned more in the Republicans' direction.
Yeah, what I take from that is it seems more about kind of big macro level political shifts and things like voter sentiment, enthusiasm, favorability, not necessarily that, TikTok has reached critical mass, and might be utilized for voters. And I just think that's important for especially the academics listening who tend to, we're so focused on one niche, which is social media communication, that we sometimes try to explain things that way rather than these sort of larger structural issues.
Yeah, I'd say just a couple of things on that as well. Is that still almost every campaign, and I think this is the best practices, even though it may be a head scratcher for some folks, is that still in almost every campaign that is out there, Republican, Democratic, underdog, or an incumbent, the first bucket that you fill on a campaign, the first line item that you fill on a campaign that you're most protective of, is the television budget, is the more conventional broadcast plus cable bucket. Now, again, nobody is Pollyannish to think that that is as effective as it was a generation ago, but is still, if you had to choose one way to communicate with voters in a political sense, in terms of likely voters, that is still the place that you are the most protective of. Now, increasingly, over the last 10, 15 years, the share of the pie that is going just into the TV bucket, has come down. Digital comes up. Some of these other things come up. And I think maybe that is a misconception out there that broadcast television is dead, that you shouldn't be investing in that it has no to minimal role to play, when in virtually every campaign of every type, every political campaign, that is the first thing that you feel and what you're most protective of. And often only once you feel like you have reached critical mass there, that you start to piece together some of these other elements, digital, mail, radio, whatnot. The one thing that I do think is not a brand new tool, but I think the tool is getting better every year, are these analytics and targeting tools that from the Democratic side, for example, are able to go in and identify which voters are the most pro-choice, for example. And so you can develop a universe of voters who you think are strongly pro-choice, but maybe also lower vote propensity. So are the types of people that would be the most likely to sit out a midterm election. Maybe they vote in presidential years, but historically not midterms. So you can marry those together of a strongly pro-choice voter with voters who are maybe need an extra touch or 10 to turn out. And that information at the individual voter level has gotten more sophisticated over the last decade, and by the hour, in some cases, gets more and more sophisticated. And there are tools, and I'm a little bit out of my wheelhouse here, but there are tools where you can, at the individual level, can go target them and give them specific content. So if there's a pro-choice voter and a pro-life voter next door to each other, or maybe even in the same household, you can identify them and figure out how to target them and give them a pro-choice ad and the importance of this election of turning out to protect the right of women to choose their own healthcare decisions. That they have to watch that ad before they can watch their YouTube video. If they have a pro-life roommate, the roommate is not necessarily hearing that information, or their next door neighbor is not hearing that information. There's even, and I don't know enough to talk about it in an informed way, but even some of the television tools, cable, satellite television tools can target household by household. And so you have this very sniper rifle approach that gets more sophisticated each cycle versus the more shotgun approach where everybody in the same media market, if you're in Georgia, 70% of Georgia is in the Atlanta media market. So instead of 70% of the state seeing the same ad, and maybe that means that you're talking about an issue like abortion because you think that's key to your election, but that there's a lot of anti-abortion, a lot of pro-life people who are seeing that ad as well, and that becomes wasteful. There are tools that are available now and are sharper by the day. It's not just abortion, but really every issue under the sun, every type of segment. And the Republicans use this very sharply as well, in ways that I would describe to sort of inflame some of the culture wars as well. And if a voter is really aggrieved by transgender people in sports or critical race theory, they can go target those voters really on an individual basis. That is a tool, a specificity that is getting better each cycle that wasn't available at all a decade ago. And each cycle, and even within cycle, becomes more and more sophisticated by the hour.
Right, which all sounds, super glitzy and super complex and interesting. But I want to dial back to what you said about television being the part of the budget that campaigns protect first. And I'm curious to hear why that is. And I'm glad you mentioned media markets, because there's been some academic research that's compared television ads and Facebook ads and basically finds that when the media market doesn't really cover the congressional district, then candidates are more likely to spend on Facebook. So basically, it's a way to get around when the media market doesn't align with your congressional district. So, I mean, what is it about television that still holds this power? Is it just because that's what older voters are watching? Is it just because it's more persuasive, or the state of mind that people are in when they're watching television versus, scrolling on their phone? I mean, why is that still so important given all these advanced targeting technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I do think some of it certainly goes to the fact of just the electorate skews disproportionately older than the electorate as a whole. But even if you look at at entities outside of politics that have younger skewing audiences, you look at Apple or Google, any of the fast food chains, any of the major corporations are still spending. You look where they are putting their dollars, and it's overwhelmingly on television. And so this is not something that's unique to politics. I think it's maybe more pronounced in politics because if the median age of the average voter in a midterm is 50 something, I suspect the average target for Apple iPhone is probably in their teens or 20s. And so it's maybe more pronounced in politics. But even you look at the big corporations who have no shortage of research and ways to figure out who their targets are and how to get at them, are still very much invested in broadcast television. And I think some of it, even as the ceiling has come down on who you can reach or the share of the electorate you can reach, it's still the best tool in the toolkit. Even if it's 50 or 60% reach versus 80 or 90% reach, nothing else has anywhere close to that. And I do think there is something to be said that the way that people absorb television ads is more passive, and you're more likely to find people who are just sort of in one place and sitting and watching and observing. And I think some of this is correlated with age as well. A generation of people who are, middle age or older, who are, not used to being able to skip ads anytime they want, not used to being able to have ad free experiences. So even if you are paying the premium, which it costs a premium to get a TV ad before a YouTube clip, where you have to literally watch the ad, the recipient, if it's younger, which is often the case, is sophisticated and they hit mute or they go to a different screen or they have some workaround. And so I do think that those two things work together. But yeah, if there's sort of one tool that you can have in the toolkit, we see this in our polling after you've had a round or two of television ads. It's not that everybody in your district knows who you are, but you can go from 10-15% name ID to 40, 60, 80% name ID using mostly a television broadcast plus satellite plus cable television approach, and certainly helps to have digital filling in some of the holes as well. But television still has the biggest reach, is the tool with the most efficacy when you are trying to do that. And I think some of that is just a reach altogether. And digital is just so fragmented as well. And I'm sure some of the people you've talked to are much better able to talk about that. But it's a punchline now just how fragmented the digital experience is. Some streaming services have lots of ads, some have no ads, some have you can pay more and get ad-free experiences. Some people probably have VPNs or whatever the term would be, so they can circumvent the ads even if the service thinks that you're watching the ads, and all of that just makes it much more difficult for a message to penetrate. So nobody in politics thinks television is as effective as it was a decade ago, but it still is the best and the most effective way to communicate with the largest possible audience at one time. But I do think to the media market point, that is an underappreciated view of politics, especially at the congressional level or lower, even as it relates to some Senate races and governors races, where if you're running for Congress and you are in New Jersey famously there's no New Jersey media market. If you're in New Jersey, you're either getting television from New York City or you're getting television from Philadelphia if you live in South Jersey. And so it just becomes virtually cost prohibitive unless you're just a billionaire pumping in your own dollars into the race. It becomes cost prohibitive if you're running for Congress in North Jersey to run TV ads. Because then you'd be paying for everybody in the New York City media market, the most expensive media market in the country, to see your ads when only a sliver of those people actually vote in your North Jersey congressional district. You'd be communicating in dozens of congressional districts beyond your individual district. So at that point, you do see that you become more reliant on cable. You become more reliant on direct mail plans. In a conventional race, there might be a direct mail plan of 8 or 10 or 12 pieces going to an individual voter would not be unusual. If you're in a district or a state where you're just priced out of the market on television, you might have 30, 40, 50 point piece direct mail plans because that becomes the main way in which people are hearing about you because you're priced out of broadcast. Cable often has low penetration or is expensive in and of itself. Digital has some but lower penetration. So if you want to talk to voters in your area, you have to mail them, and so that you literally have dozens of pieces of mail in those situations. So I think a lot of folks don't understand or haven't had to think about the difference in how candidates have to take into account media markets. There are some members of Congress. If you're running for Congress in Arkansas's 2nd district, everybody in your district is in the Little Rock media market. If you're running for Congress in the 1st Ohio district, everybody in your district is in the Cincinnati media market. That's a pretty cheap date as far as communicating goes. But if you're in a district in South Georgia, you might have some parts of your voters are in the expensive Atlanta media market, and some parts are in the Tallahassee, Florida media market, and some places are in Columbus, Georgia media market. So it can get much more expensive and much more complicated very quickly, and that's a lot of the campaign committees and donors take that into account when they're figuring out which race is the best investment. If I want to give $1,000 to a campaign that has a very affordable media market, that $1,000 is going to go a lot further than trying to give $1,000 to somebody who is running for Congress in the Los Angeles media market, where that's really just a drop in the bucket of how they can effectively communicate.
Yeah, it's so important, these media market structures. And it's interesting to hear that they still play such a role. And I think it's just so crucial to keep in mind. So I'm very glad that both that it's still relevant for campaigns, very relevant, and also that at least the academic research was on the right track with comparing TV and social media. Let's transition over to more kind of your wheelhouse, specifically in polling and focus groups. I'm curious to hear first, what would be a typical poll or a focus group, if there is one? I mean, kind of how do you conduct it in terms of what's the medium for a poll? What type of questions are you asking? And then how might that differ from a focus group setting?
Yeah, absolutely. The conventional poll, and this has changed over the last cycle or two. When I first started, 100% of our interviews were collected via landline telephones. As 2006 turns into 2008 and 10, cell phones become more common. You had 80% landline, 20% cell phone, and then within a few years, cell phones become the dominant mode of communication. And instead of people having a landline and a cell phone, a lot of people are cell phone only. And so, for a while, some surveys were almost exclusively 100% cell phone. Now, the best methodology, the best practices, really the buzzword is multimodal, where you're getting people, a small percentage still via landline, which are, certainly tilt toward older voters. You have significant share that you're reaching via cell phone, and you have a significant share you're reaching via text or online, whether it is texting a link to your phone and then you're asked to click on the link and take an online survey. Text to web is what that would be called, or the more simplistic text surveys where you just get a text and it's, press 1 for Biden, press 2 for Trump, press 3 for undecided. The more SMS text pieces, as well as online, capturing people, whether it's via email, whether it's via sort of a click in to take a survey. So every survey doesn't necessarily have every piece of that, but the buzzword certainly has become multimodal in politics, especially as it became apparent over the last few cycles that there were a certain type of voter that was just not in the surveys to the degree they should have. And it was often, to oversimplify it, it was often a more rural, small town voter with lower educational attainment, lower social trust, less likely to take surveys. And we were missing those types of voters. And I think, frankly, we probably were always missing those types of voters to some degree in polling. But the rub was those types of voters became very Trump friendly in the Trump era. In 2008, maybe that same voter broke 50-50 for Obama versus McCain, for example. And so if you were missing that voter, it wasn't wreaking havoc with the results because they largely were in line with the rest of the electorate. If we missed getting the right share of left-handed voters, you might not notice it if left-handed voters generally voted the same way as right-handed voters. So it's not a big deal in terms of the accuracy if you're missing left-handed voters. But so we realized, or it became clear, we were missing a certain type of very Trump-friendly voter. And so it became an imperative to use additional tools to get the most representative sample that we can. And going back to the idea that it's never been more complex and more expensive, frankly, to get the right interviews, that is becomes more true by the day. So you were handcuffed and challenged by just the mechanisms with which people communicate becoming more disparate. It's not just everybody's has a landline phone anymore. You have all sorts of different ways to communicate. At the same time, you saw a certain type of voter become less predictable, and if you're missing that type of voter, it was wreaking havoc on the accuracy, at least as it relates to political polling. Now, corporate world maybe doesn't have this problem. If I'm doing marketing for Coke, I'm mostly concerned about soft drink customers or Coke customers, or it's not maybe a big deal to me if there's a sliver of small towns, low social trust, lower educational attainment voter. If I'm missing that person, I probably just assume my marketing be fully representative, but it's not going to be a major issue for me if I'm not getting everybody in exactly the right share of their electorate in polling. If you're missing a voter and that voter is attitudinally different than everybody else, that's where this polling error starts to creep in. So a lot of these challenges are unique to the political world, whereas the broader survey research world, I mean, there's the survey research we hear about as news consumers is mostly about politics. There's much more survey research being done day in and day out by corporations and nonprofits and things that are not at all political than there is things that are partisan political, but we just don't hear about them, and they aren't handcuffed by some of the same necessities to be 100% accurate and 100% representative. And they also, if you're not in politics. If you think the election is going to be a little bit leaning Biden and it comes out to be a little bit leaning Trump, you have egg on your face and you have a lot of explaining to do, fair or unfairly. Whereas you're never really tested like that in most of the corporate world, where you go about your business and you communicate with your target audience, and that is that. So multimodal has become the buzzword for polling, I think accurately so, to try to do everything we can to get the most representative sample. Focus groups are in some ways similar to polling, and we would very rarely do only focus groups for a client. Focus groups are usually a complement to a survey. So if you only have, as many candidates do, many clients do, only have the budget for one or two tools, you certainly would prioritize a survey that is giving you a reliable look at the full electorate, and giving hundreds, 600, 800, 1,000 interview sample to inform strategic decisions. Where focus groups become valuable is as a complement to that, to answer some pretty specific questions. Polling tells you what people think in a given circumstance. Focus groups tell you why they think what they think, and you can go in longer form. From a political sense, focus groups are often useful in seeing, well, how do people think about a candidate? What is the first word or phrase that comes to mind? What do they know about a candidate? There's only so much of that you can get into in a 15-minute survey with 800 people. But if you want to find out, well, why do people like Biden? How do they think about Biden? What grade would they give Biden thus far? How do they compare Biden to Trump? What don't they like about Biden? You want to talk about that in long form. That's where focus groups come in. If you want to show them some content, whether it's potential TV ads, whether it's just footage of Trump or Biden speaking, how do they react to that person? So much of polling is focused on getting the message right, which is vitally important. And one of the most important roles that polling plays is to get the message right. But there's also the part of getting the right messenger. No matter how sharp a message is, if you have the wrong messenger, it's going to be diluted. So if you're a candidate and you have the right message, is it ideal for me, the candidate, to deliver that message directly to camera? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe people don't like the cut of my jib or don't like how I come across. Maybe they respond better if it's my spouse or, a kid, a child. Maybe it's better if it's somebody who knew me. Maybe it's better if it's just an announcer voiceover that's being very sort of straightforward about it. So there's all these more qualitative judgments that polling just doesn't answer, is not equipped to answer, that focus groups can really give you some real texture on, as well as just trying to understand how Americans think about some complicated issues. In a survey, you can try to come up with the best definition of critical race theory if you want. And you can say, okay, well, here's what critical race theory is. Do you favor this or oppose it, or et cetera, et cetera. But to really understand how people approach a complicated issue like that, you need more than just a minute or two in a survey. You need to say, well, what have you heard about critical race theory? What comes to mind when you hear that label? How would you define it? Here's one definition. Here's another definition. Here's what supporters say. Here's what opponents say. Here's what teachers have to say. Here's what parents have to say. And you can go through this in longer form in a way that you just don't have the ability to do in surveys. So it's very rarely a substitute. Focus groups are very rarely a substitute for surveys, rigorous quantitative surveys, but are often a very helpful complement to sharpen your messaging, sharpen some of the decisions in terms of how you communicate, and make sure that you're taking the guidance from a survey and having it as sharp as it can be. But I would say, the average governor candidate, Senate candidate is having, a few rounds of polling and 2 or 3 rounds of focus groups. Honestly, the average member of Congress probably doesn't have the resources to engage in focus groups. Some do, but that would actually be the exception rather than the rule. So there are a lot of candidates out there who are in office who don't have the luxury or haven't made the decision to engage in focus groups. So it's not a given. And if you have one or have to, again, be protective of one piece. The polling is 990 times out of 1,000 is what you're going to be the most protective of, and then utilizing focus groups as a supplement to help sharpen what you learn from the polling.
Yeah, I can totally see that. But I mean, how much do the methods feed into each other? I mean, I can understand kind of sharpening a message in terms of should it be the politician direct to camera or narration, but does the focus group insights somehow inform the polling downstream, or are they kind of relatively separate?
No, I think they are. And there's often this sort of internal discussion, not even a debate, but sort of a discussion. You can make a case to have focus groups first. If you're running for office, you want to hear how voters put some of these things in their own words. What is most important to them about what's going on in their state? What do they want to see done with the schools? What's the most important issue? How do they think about what is currently going on in their world? And to some degree, you can almost, and we've done this in many times, just rip off language directly out of somebody's mouth in a focus group and replicate that in a survey. And oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes that has real traction. And all of a sudden you have either a distinct message or a turn of phrase or a specific verbiage that you wouldn't have had, if it was just the campaign people brainstorming, that you were actually able to get out of the focus groups. The most recent example of this I can think of is our client, Gretchen Whitmer, who's governor of Michigan, and my colleague John Anceloni's done this race, but I'm familiar with the nuts and bolts here, where Michigan notoriously has very bad roads, even above and beyond, what a lot of people think their roads or bridges need to get taken care of. You could see this in the focus groups, people complaining about the roads and potholes and connecting the dots. These bad roads means I have thousands of dollars of car repairs each year, means I have to buy new cars more often. Voters in Michigan in these groups, to the degree that they knew why their roads were bad, we use this kind of mix versus that kind of mix because it was such an issue in their lives. They had to get pretty sophisticated about it. And somebody in the group said, I could vote for any sorts of person for governor, but what I really want is somebody who's going to fix the damn roads. And we heard that come out of the groups, and you see people nodding, and it sort of pops the room. And you think, okay, you remember that, you jot it down, and you put that, in a survey, or you let the candidate who was already talking about fixing the roads, that was already something that was important to her, an important part of the campaign. But the forward phrase of fix the damn roads is able to encapsulate something that breaks through. And we would see it we would put it in our TV ads. She would talk about it on the stump, and you would come back after the fact and you would say, well, in a survey, in an 800-person survey, and we would do an open end, which is a little bit of sort of a focus groupy type question in a survey. But what have you read or heard recently about Gretchen Whitmer? And we would do these word clouds, where I'm sure people know how word clouds work. The larger the font is used, the more frequently it's mentioned. And everything that would, you would see a lot of things in small font. The main things in the big font, fix damn roads. And so that was cutting through because that was capturing something with it. And even a step beyond that, which shows how these things are often symbiotic, there was also this pushback that was gotten from the political class of, yeah, this is a good message, but listen, a candidate for governor shouldn't be out there using the word damn. Maybe this was a gender thing. She's, a woman, so this is unbecoming of a woman, and this is going to turn people off. And we put that in a survey, of which is closer to opinion. Gretchen Whitmer, when she's talking about fixing the damn road, she shouldn't use language like that. Versus, that shows that's important to her and it doesn't bother me. Something like that. And you'd see 65, 70% in the survey say that didn't bother them. That, indicated, passion, and it was important to her. And so that's, I think, a good example of how these things can be symbiotic with each other. And you don't want these things siloed where depending on the sequence here, you want the poll to inform the focus groups to inform the polling. Oftentimes, polling is important in figuring out who the focus of the focus group should be. That is a term of art, focus group, because often you're zeroing in on a specific type of voter. In political races, it's mostly based attitudinally. Who are the softer voters? Who are voters who are undecided or leaning only in one direction or another? Oftentimes we will have a men's group or a women's group, or you have sort of an emphasis as older or younger, or an Anglo group versus a Latino group. But more often than not, You are basing these on attitudinal components, and just how a focus group comes together is it feels in a lot of ways like a survey. You will actually conduct sort of a mini survey, and you'll call people within a geographic area. Most of these, there are online focus groups, but we continue to, especially for political races, really think you get something extra out of the in-person group. So if you're having an in-person focus group in a strip mall in suburban Detroit, you can only pull from people who are within a 15, 20, 25-minute drive from there. So you figure out what your geographic area is, and you'll call and have a survey, and it feels like a survey to that person. Okay, what do you think about Trump? What do you think about Biden? Who might you vote for? Are you more Democratic, Republican, et cetera, et cetera? And if by the end of 8 or 10 or 12 questions, they fit the profile you're looking for, they're undecided. They don't like Trump or Biden. They're undecided. Or they like both Trump and Biden a little bit. Or they're leaning toward Trump but say they might change their mind. If they fit whatever that profile is, then at the end of that survey, they are invited to a focus group. Most of them pay $100, $150. You compensate the person for their time for a couple of hours. But even the mechanism of focus groups often sort of feels like a survey as you're determining which participants you really want in the room.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I love the focus on mixed methods, the quantitative and the qualitative, and also nice to hear a concrete example from Michigan and dealing with roads, which I can also heavily identify from my home state of Louisiana. So my last question for you has to do with governors and your work with Governor John Bel Edwards down in Louisiana. And in particular, I'm curious to hear about, what is the work like doing polling for a politician who's already in office, and how might that differ from a campaign context? I mean, in a sense, kind of what's the point or the rationale behind keeping polling going when a politician is in office and maybe doesn't have another shot at reelection?
Yeah, certainly that there can be a couple different pieces. In a first term, even if you're not fully in campaign mode or you're not polling as frequently as you would in a campaign, it'd be rare to go in a governor's race, go 2 or 3 months without polling in a governor's race. By the end of the campaign, when you're spending money and when people are actually making up their minds, you're polling every week or two. But when you're in office, maybe you would poll once or twice a year, mostly to get a sense of what is the governor's standing, how are people reacting to him or her, what are the issues that are front and center with the voters, are those aligning with what the governor is focused on? If there's not alignment, then there's an opportunity to fix that. As governor, you have the bully pulpit, you have a lot of ability to get a message out, really above and beyond anybody but a president. President has the ability to set an agenda. Presidential candidates have an ability to set the agenda. It's really difficult for Senate members, one of 100 Senate members, one of 435 House members, to set an agenda. But governors, are executives and have an ability to get media attention, to literally set legislative agendas. And so you want to make sure that you are staying in touch with the electorate. At that point, there's also often a component of helping to build legislative coalitions. Now, there are some governors, I'm sure, across the country who have big majorities and who can get anything they want through their legislature. There are some governors who are facing the other party having dramatic majorities and maybe can't get anything through their legislature. But most governors, to build legislative support, whether it's within their own party, whether it's to try to build a bipartisan coalition, if you're able to have credible polling data, that is not the only thing that I'm sure people are taking into account, but can be one component that people are taking into account to say, okay, well, Governor John Bel Edwards wants to raise the minimum wage in Louisiana from $7.25 to $10. And if you can have credible, reliable polling that says, listen, 70% of Louisianans support that, including a majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, that's a good talking point as you're trying to build support for a legislative package. The legislative end is certainly one part of it, and you're never really out of campaign mode as a first-term governor. So you're needing to be, much more attuned to public opinion. It doesn't mean you're changing your decisions by any means, but in terms of as a governor, if you've had some good accomplishments, but voters aren't aware of them, you got to figure out, okay, well, what do we have to do differently to get our message out? A lot of times that is, in Governor John Bel Edwards, that was something that we had to be very attentive to. He inherited a I've forgotten the numbers, but a massive budget deficit from his predecessor, Bobby Jindal. Louisiana can't stay in budget deficit, so Governor Edwards had to go, raise some taxes here and there, had to go make some cuts here and there to get the budget back into balance. But there had been years and years where Louisiana was beset with these budget deficits, and you would have the LSU football team saying, "Hey, maybe we'll have to cut, have fewer games this year because we're in deficits," and things like that. So the state for years and years had heard about these budget deficits. Governor Edwards gets in there, makes the tough decisions to put the state back in the black, to zero out these budget deficits, to put the state on a healthier fiscal course. But we would get in the field and survey it, and people would still think the state's still in a deficit because we're so used to that being the case. And again, they've got a lot of other things to do rather than look at state budgets or read every line in what's going on in the newspaper. So we had to be, if everybody already knew that the state was in a surplus, we wouldn't have to have been so deliberate about it. We could have focused on something else. But there was a lot of work to be done while he was governor, including in the campaign, to make sure we connected the dots. We spoon-fed voters that information that, yes, he inherited a deficit, but now the state is in a surplus. So those are some of the examples that become important. I will say that generally when governors are in second terms, some of the air comes out of the balloon. There's often a little less frequent polling unless there's a crisis, unless there's something that a governor or an incumbent, a lame duck incumbent, if you will, has to really get their arms around. A lot of it is more first-term focused as a prelude to the campaign in a lot of ways.
Super interesting. Yeah, we often don't hear too much. I mean, obviously we know about the permanent campaign, but not so much about what actually happens in office or what types of methods are used or, how is technology changing the game. So really interesting to hear how campaigns are ticking here in 2022. So Zach, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, Michael, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
I've just been speaking with Zach McCrary, partner and pollster at Impact Research. Be sure to check out his podcast, Pro Politics. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let's see, I think we'll have one more episode with a top-level political strategist, maybe one or two more on the academic front, and then the year's over, 7th annual year in review. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Elbow. See you next time.